Welcome to another episode where I get to speak to incredible people from around the globe. And today I'm particularly excited because not only am I talking to another former police officer, but she's literally only a stone's throw from me. She's only a few miles down the road in Birmingham, or was in Birmingham. She lives on the outskirts now, lives in a beautiful town called Warwick. Is Warwick a town or a city now?
Yeah, Warwick's a town, yeah.
It's a beautiful town. And if you've never been to Warwick and you're in the UK, you've got to go and visit. It's got Warwick Castle, which is one of the best kept castles in the UK. I've been goodness knows how much, but it's also a nice part of the world. It really is. So, Hannah, great to have you on here. You were a police officer with West Midlands Police. Is that the second largest police force, I think it is, in the UK?
It is, yeah.
So, West Midlands Police, back in 2015, was it that you left the police service? Do you want to just tell us your story about the police service?
So I joined in 1998. I was only 21. I think you know everything, don't you, when you're 21, Carl? So I thought that was it.
And you're like the most indestructible person out there as well, right?
Oh, you're indestructible. You know everything. Off you're going to go, and little do you know when you land in the police. But so it was a huge learning curve for me, but it was fantastic. And I was very lucky, Carl. I had a fantastic career. I loved my job. It wasn't something I'd always wanted to do, nothing like that at all. Came about it a little bit by chance.
Right.
And so I was very lucky to have a brilliant response, crew, sergeants, all that sort of stuff for many years. So I was in uniform response at first. This for about 6 years. Then I went to local CID, and then I went to Force CID around the West Mids. So I did have a fantastic career, and I did love it. I would say it became as I think policing can do, it became my identity.
Yeah.
It's definitely a passion of mine. I just definitely have found my career in life. But as I'm sure you know, and as probably many people know who's listening, it also took its toll on me, as it does on many, and that was starting to affect me probably in the last few years before I left in the end in 2013. And so nearly 15 years really, and it had really started to take its toll on me. I will say, Carl, a lot of people talk about PTSD, people talk about trauma that the police see, but I would say for me it was a real drip effect.
Yes.
So there wasn't sort of something overnight that I thought, oh, this isn't for me, or this something particularly awful had happened to me. I had a real drip effect of going downhill, I'd say, mentally, emotionally, physically, probably for about 2 years.
I mean, it really resonates with me when you talk about the drip effect, and I think that's such a powerful but yet simple way of explaining it. You literally exposed day in, day out to different kinds of challenging scenarios. What did that feel like for you, Hannah, going through it? Because, we're going to talk about it in the context of policing, but there are so many other organizations, and some of these could be literally desk-bound jobs in organizations, but they're still exposed to some level of trauma, of challenge, and that drip effect that you're talking about can still resonate with other people and demonstrate itself in other people as well, can't it? So what did it feel like for you? What was that drip?
So what it felt like for me looking back is, and I think you're so right, Cole, to say it's not just about policing, because for me it was also that I was having problems at home, for example, as well. So I think it's sometimes when I think we're actually quite resilient as human beings. I think we can take quite a bit, but I think it's when it's all piling up, and it was piling up at work. It was piling up around the culture at work as well. So inside the job, as well as what we're seeing outside the job. And then it was piling up at home as well. So I think for me, there was no real place to put it all down. There was no real place where everything felt fine, or perhaps everywhere I was maybe doing a good job or something like that. There was obstacles, there was stresses, there was difficulties at every place. And I think that is something that then really starts to take its toll on people.
I think this is fascinating because, and the reason why it's so fascinating, Hannah, is because we're looking at it from two different perspectives. I mean, for me, I went on to become a senior police officer. You were at the front line all that time. And I think it's so easy for us to assume that the senior officers have got it easy, or we might say, well, the frontline officers have got it easy. And it's the same in any other organization, but we're talking about something very human. And for me, this is really fascinating to understand, because of course the job, as we call the police service, if you've been in the police service, you call it the job. The job really had an impact on me. As you're talking, I'm reflecting on the divorce that I went through and the complications at home, the hours that I spent at work, and how I would literally drop everything to go and deal with the next crisis at work. I put it before anything else in my life. And I'm guessing it was something quite similar with you.
Also, Cole, what's really important that you were saying about that human sort of element is when I actually talk about my experience as well, and I go and do talks in the police. And one of the turning points for me, where sort of almost like a little light went out inside of me around policing, because as I said, you've heard how I said how I loved it so much. And one of the times that a little light went out for me was in 2010, when West Mids went through something called Paragon. And Paragon was a huge change across the whole force.
I remember it.
Do you? Yeah. And what ultimately the basis of Paragon was, certainly for detectives, which I was at the time, is they took every single detective across the whole force, no matter your experience, no matter your interests, no matter your skill set. And you will know, Cole, that the diversity that could be for detective roles across the force. Mm-hmm. Yeah, hugely diverse. And what they did is they put us really all in a bit of a melting pot, and they didn't pull names out of a hat, but how it felt like is pulled names out of a hat, and you would go where you were put. And it even though they said you could have a say on that, that wasn't something that you could enforce. So you could sort of say, I'd like to do this, but they wouldn't necessarily support that. And what I realised in that is that people got moved from, let's say, a specialist organised crime team, organised crime gang team, to adult public protection, let's say, and they are completely different skill sets, completely different roles, interests, passions, and so on. And I myself got moved. I got moved teams, and I got moved stations, and I got moved roles. So it's similar-ish roles, but different roles. And a little light went out in me, Cole, because I realised that we were starting to be treated as, and it's a bit of a cliche, isn't it, but like a number, rather than actually what is this officer's passion, what is their strengths and their skills, what are they delivering to those victims when the victims pick up the phone. And that had sort of gone out the window.
What you're giving us is an example of how miscommunicated strategies, the impact that they can have on the front line and how they make people feel. And I'm all about culture, and I've seen it all too often in the police service and in other organisations where decisions are made for the right reasons at a very strategic end of the organisations, but how they're communicated and then how they're delivered to the front line is awful. And what I'm trying to say to organisations that I work with, it's the emotions that you're talking about right now. I was made to feel like a number. I lost that, a bit of a blue light in me went out, and all of this kind of stuff. That's exactly what we need to avoid in organizations. If anything, what we need to do in organizations is switch on as many lights as we possibly can to inspire and motivate our staff to do even better. And if I remember Paragon, I wasn't in the same police force as you, but I do remember having some conversations around. I'm sure that was all around the austerity measures that were going around the whole of the UK. All public sector organisations were trying to make savings as a result of the financial crisis in 2008. And there's also something around, I think what West Midlands Police were trying to do was introduce tenure back into policing. Tenure is where, you work in a particular role for X amount of years, and then after that you have to move on. And I think it was quite heavy-handed, really, quite clumsy and heavy-handed the way it was done by the sounds of it. But if it's had that impact on you, imagine the impact that it's had on so many other frontline officers.
What I do know is that every time I do this talk, every time, the feedback afterwards is, I remember Paragon. That's how I felt. It really resonated. So, and you'll hear from me sort of moving on. I have other things that I talk about, and that sort of changed my view on policing and what happened to me. But Paragon is what people say on LinkedIn, they come up to me after talks and say, that's exactly how I felt in Paragon. So you're so right, Cole, that we have to, sometimes these decisions have to be made. Like you said, strategic decisions have to be made, but the communication of it and the actual practical application of it is so important to the people who are doing that job.
That was an incredible time for a lot of public sector organisations in the United Kingdom. We had to make millions of pounds of savings just to meet the austerity measures. So that is like, big change processes. And in that change process, we need to manage that change as best as we can. And communication, for me, is like the number one thing that we have to get right. And what you're saying is that communication wasn't right. And I don't want to, say this was West Midlands Police, because many other police forces were also doing something similar, driving some other changes, and so were other organisations in the public sector. And a lot of staff were saying the kind of things that you were saying. I remember in my own force in Derbyshire how, our police headquarters was one of the friendliest police headquarters you could ever go into. We had a reputation in Derbyshire that it was like a family, and people knew each other, and people would talk to each other. But by the time that I left, people would be walking around headquarters with their heads down, because you didn't know if you're going to have your job. You didn't know if there were going to be any more cuts. It was so demoralised. It was like a ghost town. It was sad.
It was sad, wasn't it? It was a sad period of time, and definitely for me, as I said, because I was somebody that loved my job so much and gave so much to my job. And I don't mean that move completely wiped it out for me, Cole, because that it wasn't enough to sort of make me go, but it was definitely a change for me. It started a change, part of that drip effect. But then it moved on, and I'm sure you sort of recognise this theme, but being under-resourced and overwhelmed with work. I dealt with a lot of rape and sexual violence, dealt with a lot of child victims and witnesses of crime, a lot of historical sex abuse. So an enormous amount of that, as you said, that human element needed on an extreme level every single day and every single shift. But when we talk about the human side of it, Cole, I think before I dealt with that quite well because I felt we had the resources and the support of the criminal justice system, not all the time, but a lot of the time, to move those cases forward, to look at justice for some of those victims, to give time to those victims, all the things that really, really mattered to me. And again, that started to change. So that human element started to get replaced with policy, procedure, counting rules, things that might be necessary for strategy for organisations, but that's not how human beings thrive. We don't thrive on procedure and a statistic and accounting rules.
We went through something though, and a lot of organisations do this, where they hide behind policy or KPIs, and everything becomes very process driven and very mechanistic, doesn't it? And the more mechanistic you become, the less human you are going to become as an organisation. You lose your personality and your culture within that, and that's sort of what you're describing, isn't it?
100%. I know. I'd say about the last 2 years before I was in the job, I never truly felt like I helped anybody properly and fully, and that was a massive blow to me because it was such an important part of policing for me. And so I think we can actually deal with an awful lot of exposure to trauma. I think we can be very resilient, but you have to add in you almost have to add in more human elements for policing or other jobs that are exposed to that sort of trauma or those sort of roles. You have to add more human element in to balance it out properly. And for the police, it was getting less and less and less of the human element side.
I find that incredibly frustrating and sad at the same time, in the sense that I absolutely agree with you that we need to understand the human element in the people that work within any organisation, including the police service, and also understand and take that leap of faith to understand that the more we do for the people, the more they will probably do in terms of delivery on performance. But because it's not measurable and it's not driven by any KPIs, and it takes some courage to make that decision. But there's lots of anecdotal evidence, isn't there, that if your people aren't right, the performance is never going to be right. And you're talking about that. There you were, a very keen police officer, very, saw it as a vocation, but the light started going out step by step. What could we do to bring the light back? or even to maintain the light in people in organizations?
Yeah, to maintain the light. I was having a think before we did the podcast, because I was thinking about, you said about human-centered leadership, and I think it should be the form of leadership that you never, ever need a research study to say we know that is what will be the best way to do it. We'll never need statistics for that. We'll never, and you said we won't get it with statistics, you will not get it with research. But if you can't run some leadership and most of our leadership on your gut instinct, on common sense, on your heart and your brain, if you can't bring it all together to deliver, you can't ever deliver human-centered leadership. If you constantly run it on statistics and research, you can't. I'm not saying there's no importance in that. Of course there is. But we don't need research to tell us how to be human beings.
Fundamentally, for me, there are skills within policing that you need to learn, right? I was a goal commander. I needed to go on a whole host of programs and courses to teach me how to be the very best goal commander that I could be. And you would have had to go on programs and courses to learn how to be a detective. I had to go on programs to learn how to be an SIO, etc., etc. But then the application of those skills is not something that you are taught. It's not a skill set that you pick up. This is emotional intelligence in practice. It's the application. We can all go to, university and get the top qualifications, but what separates us is how we apply that knowledge in the workplace. And that for me is all human-centered leadership. It's all emotional intelligence. And that's where you're coming from. And, statistics, data, analytics is not necessarily what drives that.
I don't think it will ever hugely drive us as human beings, if I'm honest, Cole. I think it can drive, it can look at performance, it can look at where you might put funding, it can look at where you might put training, 100%. I don't think it'll ever drive us as a human being. And I think I can look back at some of the teams. As I said, I was very lucky. So I can look back at some of the leaders I had and how they took us as a team, and they didn't treat us all the same. And I don't mean in terms of equality. I mean who did that job, who was good at that job, who looked after us all, who would be the person to kick the door in, who, and they absolutely took all our strengths as a team and worked them brilliantly. But also, Carl, just some real basics. I can remember an inspector we had, and each month he'd sort of almost do his own awards thing, and he'd do an award for, and sometimes it was the most prisoners, but sometimes it was the best interview, sometimes it was the best teamwork, sometimes it was the best blag. We'd have a bit of fun with it as well. But we felt like that inspector had bothered about his team as people. I
did something similar when I took over the content management department, where the call center and the contact center was, and I used to have this employee of the month type thing, but it was somebody who's voted by their own peers for whatever it might be. And like you, it wasn't something specific. It could be the happiest person, the person that makes me the most happy. So something like that,
Exactly.
And what we used to do, we'd take their photograph and we'd put it on this wall that we'd created. And so you'd have this wall full of photos. The idea was eventually I wanted everybody's photo on there, so everyone felt included. But my senior colleagues used to, in private conversations or in meetings, used to really take the mickey out of what we were trying to achieve and didn't get it, didn't understand it. Why are you doing that? How silly is that? And that for me was a real eye-opener in terms of how a lot of leaders won't get it. They won't understand where you're coming from necessarily. And that's not to say that they're not emotionally intelligent. Not everybody is at the same starting point, I guess. And not everybody sees everything the way you see it, which can be a good thing, in terms of cognitive diversity and things like that. So for you, there was a lot going on, wasn't there? There were other things that happened in your life, in your career, that, caused lights to start flickering out. What else would you say created that eventual sort of you leaving the police service decision?
So as I said, sort of mentally and emotionally, I was going downhill. I didn't recognise that as mental health. That wasn't talked about in the police at all. So I didn't recognise that. But then I also got physically ill as well and had breast cancer. So that was back in 2011. And I was off long-term sick. Something that again was another light bulb, Carl, is that as awful as that was and that diagnosis was, the other thing I felt was relieved. And I was just so relieved that I was off work.
You were relieved that you'd got cancer so that you could be away from work.
And that showed me kind of where, Hannah, that's where life is, that you are relieved that, probably not relieved I got cancer, but relieved that I wasn't going into work every day and that I didn't have to face those jobs and the people and find that kindness and compassion for everybody else except me again. And I was relieved. And the other thing I'll say, Carl, as well, and this is to do with the police culture, but I'm sure is in many other business cultures, is that I was relieved that I had a good enough reason to be off sick.
I was just going to say, I was just phrasing it in my head. You felt relieved that you had a legitimate reason.
And I would not have gone off with stress or whatever it was I'd been struggling with before. And as I said, I didn't really recognise that, but I wouldn't have done.
Do you think this is true of a lot of people, that they wait too long until they get really ill because they don't want to be seen to be going off with stress? So they wait and then something big happens and then they feel this relief.
100%. And I think the narrative is changing a little bit now, bit by bit. And again, that drip thing, we can only do it bit by bit, can't we? So it is changing bit by bit, but it's still very much the case that we wait until we're on our knees, really, whether that's through mental health, whether it's through problems at home, whether it's through your physical health.
You're still working with police forces now. Is it specifically police forces that you're doing some work with around culture change, around wellbeing?
Yeah, mate. I do work with the emergency services, so I do work with NHS staff as well. But yes, in terms of going into forces, it is with police forces.
What's the language? What's the rhetoric that's going on? How well are you accepted now when you try to walk in through those doors into a police organisation and say, "Hey, I want to help you with your well-being of your staff"?
Generally speaking, from a senior management position, you're welcomed. I will say that. If I'm going to be honest, is there probably two different types of welcome. I think there's a welcome where they know they have to tick that box and do it. And then there's a genuine welcome, and that there is a difference.
That resonates. I get that. But
I think that would be all organisations, Colin. And that narrative, again, is changing and is getting better. I would say week by week it's getting better, that is a positive. Yeah, it is. If I do talks and workshops with, it depends who you do it with, doesn't it, always, but with frontline operational DCs, DSs, PCs, PSs, at first there's definitely resistance to that. If I'm honest, I think because I'm from the police and my personal story, that helps break that down almost immediately. You can feel that energy change in the room, 100%. So that helps, that probably I have that credibility a little bit of understanding their role. But honestly, by the end, pretty much universally, Carl, it's really positive and really accepting and really positive and genuinely wanting to make some changes and realising they probably should make some changes, a bit of both.
Yeah, I'm really encouraged by that, though, Hannah. And, one thing I will say about the police service, I genuinely believe that there is a desire within the police service and organisations. Most senior leaders have this desire to create organizations where everyone feels valued, but that simple word of feeling valued is very complex in its delivery. It's multifaceted, very, very complex, and one of the elements of it is the work that you do around well-being. People need to feel psychologically safe in that environment, and I think the challenge with the police service is we are often faced with physical dangers and psychological dangers outside of the work that we do. The challenge is, are we psychologically safe when we're back inside the building of the police station? And that's always been a big question for me. And if you don't feel psychologically safe inside the building, then that should be alarm bells ringing, shouldn't it?
I agree. And I think that's creating more of the mental health and wellbeing problems in the police than possibly what they deal with outside. And that's a big statement. I know I'm not saying that it doesn't take its toll, because of course it does. But as you said, if you have got support, if you've got backup, if you've got trust, if you've got open communication within your organisation, then they have a safe space to come and dump all that stuff from the outside. And then I think we create much more resilience. But if that breaks down, then you just it literally all stays in, doesn't it? It stays inside.
Where would you say you got most of your emotional support from within the police service?
From my team originally at the start would be my absolute sort of colleagues and team, and my sergeants. I was very lucky with my sergeants. I think part of my problem is I didn't have that in my move under Paragon. This isn't a blame game either, is it, Cole?
No, absolutely not. It's a learning game.
Yeah, it's a learning game, and I wasn't bullied or anything like that. This was, again, I think a result of Paragon, because what happened is every single detective moved on the same day. So you literally, let's say our team was 15, about 10 of those people were new to the team and had come from all different places, possibly didn't want to move. So there was some resistance there. The sergeants didn't know us. The inspectors didn't know us. We didn't know the building, the telephone numbers, where the custody block was, where the toilet was, you didn't know anything. And that's fine when you're one new person and the whole team is settled and they'll help you and you will all support each other. This was 10 new people running around like headless chickens a bit. So it was that support mechanism that I'd had in the sort of 12 years prior to that literally almost disappeared overnight. And it really matters. The people on your team, the people that you talk to, the people that you're going to those sort of jobs with, it really matters that you like and trust one another as much as possible. I know you can't all love each other, but as much as possible. Yeah.
And that's about creating the right culture within your team, within your organization, within your department. You build that trusting culture. And I always say that trust is the foundation of any good functioning team. If you haven't got trust there, you haven't got a lot of the other constituent parts of functionality within teams. If you were to, go back to where you were, would you have done anything differently? Do you feel sometimes that I wish I'd done this and I wish I'd done that? Is there anything that you feel you could have done to maybe improve things, move things in the right direction?
Yeah, 100%. Don't mean in terms of regret. I try not to do that, and the situation is as it is, and you've got to learn from that. But yes, 100%, it's important to go back and look and learn. And I have a slide I use in my talk, and it says on it, your wound is not your fault, but your healing is your responsibility.
Oh, I love that.
It's really, really important, Cole, because we do talk about the organisation, we do talk about funding, we do talk about resource, we do talk about culture, and it's important, but ultimately, my health was and is my responsibility. So me being a human being and what it matters to me being a human being and what makes me feel good, what makes me feel well, what helps me connect is my responsibility at the bottom line.
I really, really love that. I'm going to repeat that just for the audience there, that your wound is not your fault, but your healing is your responsibility. And it's so similar to something I would say when I talk about leadership and I'm delivering one of my programs. I say, look, one of your fundamental responsibilities as a leader is to look after you. If you don't look after yourself, then you're not going to give the best of yourself to those around you. And that's your fundamental responsibility as a leader, So I love that phrase.
And it's so true, Cole, because I didn't speak up and ask for help. That was my responsibility. I didn't, if people had asked me if I was all right and happy, I probably would have said yeah, because I wouldn't have even stopped for a minute to check if I was all right and to check if I was happy. And that's my stuff. That's my responsibility to do that.
So if you were to send this message out to, other police officers out there or people in the emergency services or in any organisation, to be quite honest, where they are feeling that their lights are going out, as you described it, where they are feeling under pressure, where they are feeling under mental trauma or anxiety or some kind of an adverse impact on their mental health, what would you say is the number one thing that they should be doing?
Talking about it.
Talking about it to anybody that you can do.
I'd pick carefully who I talk to about it. I would maybe have a little thought over who I talk to. But what I will say, it doesn't mean necessarily that you have to go for therapy. That's obviously something I do. And I did do for myself too. And it was fantastic. But that's not for everybody. But it just even sharing the words to somebody else that things aren't great brings it out to your own awareness. Because I think once we speak things and once we talk and we share, it stops having the same power over you that it does when it's, I'm going to use another quote, sorry, but another quote is, you're only ever as sick as your secret. And when we keep it in and it's a secret and we can't tell anybody and we're ashamed or we're frightened, it will have so much power over you, and not a good power over you.
Yeah. Well, I love old-fashioned phrases and quotes and analogies, and I'm just going to share one with you. A problem shared is a problem halved, and I think that's sort of where you're coming from. There's a lot of wisdom in these old sayings, isn't there? And yes, organisations have got a long way to go. All organisations, we need to be constantly vigilant on the people side of our businesses. If we don't look after our people, then our people can't really work to their nth degree and their full potential, can't deliver the kind of performance that you want. And from the perspective of the people, anybody that might be going through challenging times, please learn to talk to people, learn to share your innermost secrets, as you call it, your innermost pain, if you like, and you'll find that it lightens you. But unless you talk to people, nobody can support you through that. And in most organizations, there are some departments, some units that you can talk to. Maybe they're underused, I don't know, but reach out to these professionals within your organization, or if you have to, reach outside of your organization to get the care and support that you need. Hannah, I want to thank you so much for sharing your journey with us, your thoughts, your wisdom. It's been awesome. And I've particularly enjoyed it because I'm hearing of the frontline impact resulting from some of the big decisions that organisations make. And this is not about the police service. It just so happens that we're both police officers, we have been police officers, but this is about any organisation. It happens in all sorts of organisations across the world. Hannah, thank you so much.
Thank you.